Hello and welcome to We the People. On the program today, a complex subject but one that impacts us all. The subject of clinical trials. Trials that are necessary for new frontiers of medicine and research. But on the other side, we have also seen health activists petition the Supreme Court to ask whether norms and guidelines are being properly followed and whether the informed consent of people who are part of these trials is in fact being taken in the way that is necessary. Earlier this year, the government spoke about easing some of the restrictions that have in fact held back clinical trials in India. What is known as phase 3 trials, the government said, will now be an exception rather than the norm, especially if the drug has been approved in the United States, Europe, Australia, Canada, or Japan. At the same time, the Indian Council of Medical Research is all set to renew guidelines and ethics that must be followed on clinical trials. Ayurveda drugs will now also need stringent monitoring in part as part of trials, but academic research for drugs that are already approved will not need prior permission. On the program today, for those who are often terminally ill and desperate for a solution, clinical trials are imperative. But for many, when they sign on for a trial, they don't really understand what they're signing up for, which is why informed consent gets the question mark that it has. Let me start with you, Soumya Swaminathan, as somebody who represents the Indian Council for Medical Research. There has been fierce debate and it's a very polarizing subject. There are people who will argue that it is often the poor, the uneducated who end up being part of these trials, that they do not in fact understand the consent that they are giving and that there isn't enough monitoring. They see a lot of this as a kind of big pharma conspiracy to push new drugs into the market. Where is that space that the ICMR would be comfortable with where you're not holding back science and research and life-saving drugs, but you're still ensuring that the poor are not exploited in this process?
I would just like to start by saying that none of the treatments we have today, whether it's a vaccine or a drug, would be available if we hadn't done a clinical trial. So whether it's a polio vaccine or whether it's a drug for TB, it has to go through the stages of clinical trials. There should be no doubt in anybody's minds that clinical trials are essential for medicine to progress. Now, having said that, you come to the conduct of clinical trials, and there we need to pay attention to several different aspects. You have the investigators, usually doctors or a team of people. You have the sponsors, could be a drug company but not necessarily. The ICMR, for example, sponsors a number of clinical trials for diseases of the poor.
So why are you renewing the guidelines if everything is as is?
Well, the reason we are reviewing the ethical guidelines is that things change. The last time these guidelines were made was in 2006.
Yes.
And lots of new things happen in medicine, especially new technologies and new areas like in genetics and stem cells, in assisted reproduction. So there are a lot of new areas which we are trying to address. Also the issue of vulnerable populations, tribals and children.
So I just want to give you one figure, and this is again a figure that's vastly disputed, but this is an official figure from a former health secretary, Mr. Desi Raju, who said that between 2005 to 2012, 475 drugs were tested, and he believed that 80 deaths that took place in this period could have been related to clinical trials. So there is also a great deal of argument actually over when deaths take place. Are they due to unrelated causes? Are they due to the trials? Are they due to the illness that the person is already suffering from? Does the ICMR weigh in actually on the cost of human life that has taken place over the years in these trials?
So the system is basically the ethics committees. So prior to the Supreme Court ruling, there was, when the case was filed, that many people had died due to clinical trials. Now you can die due to the disease and you can be part of the clinical trials. But is it related to the intervention or not? That determination has to be made by an expert committee, and then compensation needs to be paid if it's related.
So let me open this up. Rama Baru, what concerns health rights activists the most at this point about trials, about the fact that many of these restrictions could be eased?
The health rights activists actually brought out the PIL in response to the manner in which the clinical trials were done. And I think I want to speak to what Soumya said, that what was the function of the ethics committee? Were the subjects adequately informed about the process, what exactly the trial would entail, and what would be some of the consequences? Now, I think what has happened during that period before the PIL was instituted is that a plethora of ethics committees came up. Many of them were private ethics committees. And
What do you mean by private ethics
meaning
committees?
they were not, you know,
They were the
just-
hospital's own private ethics
yeah,
committees.
it
and
could
so
be
on.
hospitals, it could also be, and I think the kind of scrutiny and rigor that an ethics committee needs to really go through in protocols and deciding the ethical guidelines that need to be followed, and how do you present the technical information to a lay person, and how do you actually transact that, those really require some level of
So
scrutiny.
what I'm hearing you say is that there's self-appointed ethics committees. Let me get Sanjay Parekh, a senior advocate for the Swasthya Adhikar Manch. You actually can't get two people to agree on this. There is one argument that we actually need to move much quicker. There are too many regulations. It's an over-regulated sector. There's another argument that there is a class dimension to it.
As far as clinical trials are concerned, naturally it has to go forward. There are so many new diseases which are coming. So we never made an argument before the court that you should stop the clinical trials.
Okay.
The argument was very simple. Ultimately, there are subjects who are involved. The drug companies treat our country as country of poor people, and therefore the informed consent which is required to be taken is not taken. They are taken as guinea pigs, and that has come in parliamentary committee report. Now, who are the persons who look after it monitoring? This ethics committee consists of all private people who sit together. They nominate themselves. I am talking of the situation now. There is a registration, etc. Some improvement has come. So they sit down and form a committee. Then there are independent investigators who are appointed by the drug companies. Now, if some serious adverse effect takes place, SAEs as we call it, or death, who will ultimately monitor that the serious impact has taken place? It is only the private company which is doing it, gives the information that so many deaths have taken place. And just give me one second, because I want to give you the figure which will shock you. That from January 2005 to December 2013, total deaths which took place were 3,458. They said attributable to clinical trials only 89.
That's the figure I quoted.
From where the figure comes in, the figure has been given to the ministry by the private drug company.
So are you saying the government are you saying that the government is understating the
There's
deaths?
nothing.
But how do you even
No,
establish that?
How we started, there was not even a compensation.
I just want Soumya to come in on that. 1 minute, Sanjay ji, and I'm moving along. You know, I actually think this is also a problematic area, the absence of reliable, confirmed official data. So we're stuck between the official figure put out by the government and the much bigger claims made by health rights activists, because the government doesn't seem to be putting out its own data. Doesn't that speak to poor monitoring?
It's going to be difficult for the government to collect data on all the clinical trials, but I think the point is we have to have a quality system and an audit at each step. The ethics committees actually are central to this whole thing. The institution where now of course there's compulsory registration by the CDSCO, so there are about 1,100 ethics committees which are registered, and only those institutions are allowed to do clinical trials. Similarly, all clinical trials are registered with our clinical trial registry that the ICMR runs, so we know what's happening in the country. But as far as this causality is concerned, we depend on the local committee to make the causality assessment. There should be some auditing and checks of that, to make sure that these things are being done.
But when you say it's difficult for the government to collect the data, then it takes us back, Sunita Thate, to the fact that we will depend on private companies. Now, if we do depend on private companies, private hospitals, then you will face that allegation that, okay, how do we know the doctors are not colluding with pharma companies, which is the allegation that comes up again and again. As somebody who heads the Indian Society for Clinical Research, how do you address this skepticism?
So let me clarify one thing. World over, clinical trials happen exactly in this manner, that you have investigators working in hospitals who collect data, who provide data to the regulators, basis which the drug either gets approved or more trials are asked for, or the drug simply gets rejected. So we are following exactly the same norms that
So we don't have softer regulations is what you're saying?
Absolutely not. And as a society that works for welfare of clinical research professionals, we don't want softer regulations. The regulations have to be stringent, but at the same time they have to be balanced. They have to be balanced in favor of all the stakeholders, the patients, the investigators, the ethics committees and the innovators. Because as you rightly said, if we say no to clinical trials, we are saying no to innovation, and then we have no hope to meet our unmet medical needs. So that's something I think we should make it very clear. And while it is correct that the investigator will report adverse events or serious adverse events,
but who is this investigator and who's paying the investigator?
So the investigator, again, contrary to the myth, investigator doesn't get paid as such for doing clinical trials. This is a common myth. There is a clinical research grant because clinical research involves lot of efforts. You need to have a study coordinator, you have to have certain infrastructure at the site.
No, I think
All
what I'm
that
getting
goes
to
the
is the
institution.
argument, Sunila, would be made that if the pharmaceutical companies themselves are in fact financing this investigation, you cannot expect that investigation to be above or strictly neutral.
It is because there is also independent monitoring bodies that are appointed, and the ethics committee at the hospital, as Dr. Soumya said, they are supposed to give a governance over the research that is happening within
So
their
would you
remit.
say that in India it's over-regulated or it's under-regulated?
I would say that the current regulations which have come in force in last, I would say 18 months or so, they are right for our country given the level of socio-economic transformation that we have had, given our unique issues as India, where we are going to have people only understanding, let's say, a regional language, or even people who will not have have a limited capacity to read and
So
write.
let's bring in Poonam and Professor Veer Chauhan. Poonam.
Sunila, you say that we follow the global guidelines, but most countries, America, Japan, US, UK, have the guidelines as laws. In India, they're just recommendations. A country where laws aren't followed, where will the recommendations be followed? And it's not just about deaths. What about violations of a different kind?
What do you
All
mean
the
by
women-
violations?
Okay, for instance, the trials, the SPV vaccine.
HPV vaccine, yeah.
HPV vaccine, 3 people, even if 3 people died, it's not good enough. And even if the cause has not been established between the death and the vaccine, the fact that ethical guidelines were flouted, we are not even questioning that.
1 minute, because you've brought up the HPV vaccine and it's such a hot issue right now, I just want to point out that the government has actually accepted the safety of this vaccine, the cervical cancer vaccine, and the debate is now whether to put it as part of the public health program.
I
And on
also
the deaths,
accept
I just want to respond and then you can respond. And on the deaths, the argument has been made by the investigators. The ICMR said that based on the inquiry, it is certain that the causality of the 7 deaths was not related to the HPV
Even
vaccine.
I've heard that,
Okay.
and that's what I've read. But what about the fact that there wasn't informed consent? What about the issue of vulnerability, which you and Soumya brought out, that you take the most vulnerable population where the informed consent wasn't taken? These are orphans in a school. But I don't want to make this the only issue. I want to say broadly, ethical guidelines is not just a tick mark or just a ethical informed consent. It's about making the patient understand that they can come out of the trial anytime without not being paid the compensation. What are the possible risks and side effects? Possible even. Have all this been explained, and is there a person, in case there is somebody vulnerable who doesn't understand the implications? Take the case of another ICMR study where, as you know, cancer lesions were spotted and women were not treated. What about all those women? They may not have died.
What trial was that?
Not the cervical cancer, the cancer trials, which happened in the 80s. And as a country, you know, we do not, we responded 1964, the Helsinki guidelines came out. ICMR came out with our guidelines in 1980. I do believe that there is a push within the ICMR. There is a commitment to making it a law.
But you're going back again and again to the fact that those who are part of trials don't really understand what they're getting in for. Professor Chauhan, you have worked on so many...
and that's
why
why the international agencies are coming to India.
So,
But
quick
just one
response.
clarification I want to make here, it's important. Clinical research regulations and ethical guidelines very much have a legal status in India. They are not merely guidelines. Today also, when you apply to drugs controller, no ma'am, it is a law, it is a law. And you know, when you apply to drug controller, you get approval letter. Suppose you get approval letter after all the scrutiny. It very clearly says that you have to do the trial as per requirements of Schedule Y of Drugs and Cosmetic Act and following the biometric.
So it's not just a guideline, it has to be implemented.
It is a law.
It's a law. It's a law. Okay, so let's
Yes.
clarify that there and get Professor Chauhan. You've worked on the path-breaking malaria vaccine. You have stood up again and again and said research should be easier. But to this class debate that does enter these conversations, Professor Chauhan, how do you respond to this? Because this is something there are no easy answers to, because how often do we actually see educated, wealthy people being part of these trials unless they're really desperate and perhaps in the last stages of their lives or their loved ones' lives?
I think the rules, if we ask the question, clinical trials should be done or not, all of us will say clinical trials should be done. Yes. This is how we got all the drugs that we use. And to call humans guinea pigs, I think that line should be disappearing. I think we're insulting people here.
Why do you have a problem with the phrase guinea pigs, which Sanjay used?
Because they're not guinea pigs, they're humans. This is absolutely rubbish.
I think what he means by that is that they
I
don't
think
understand
insulting
what they're signing up for.
Let me just finish.
Yeah.
You don't take their consent and they do not know what is happening.
So
on
let
them.
me just say
that's
that
the reason.
you had your chance. Let me just say,
Okay.
if we do trials, if we don't follow the rule, if we do a shoddy trial, we should not do the trials.
Yeah.
There's no room for bad quality shoddy trials. There's no room for not getting absolutely clear the explaining to the person who's going to be either taking drug or a vaccine. And this is how trials are done everywhere else. Thailand has perfected this art. South Africa does trials much before. If you ask me as a working scientist, the dice is really loaded against us as a scientist, as the PIs. We are scared even to start thinking of going to the clinical trials because laws are really stringent. I think India has probably the most stringent law.
So you're saying the opposite of Pune,
I'm going on record. Take 15 years. It took us 15 years after the molecule was synthesized to go to phase 1 trial. We successfully did phase 1 trial, followed all. There's no room for not taking care of people. You are using, I don't want to use the word guinea pigs, I call them volunteers.
So let me put this to Anand Rai. You went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's got involved. That's one of the reasons we're seeing more stringent guidelines coming up. But what happens to those who will say, and we're just going to hear Vivek's story, who will say, listen, I want a quicker pace to these trials. It should not take as long as Professor Chauhan is saying. आप क्या बोलेंगे आनंद साहब?
देखिए ऐसा है कि मैं खुद डॉक्टर हूँ. जब मैंने देखा कि किस तरीके से कंसेंट ली जा रही है,
किस तरीके से?
अंग्रेजी के कंसेंट फॉर्म होते थे. जब मैंने 2005 में मामला उठाया, एक गरीब आदमी से आप उस पर अंगूठा लगवा लेते हो और उस पर ट्रायल शुरू कर देते हो. जब लोग लाइक किसी की डेथ होती है या सीरियस एडवर्स इवेंट होता है, उसको नहीं पता कि ये ड्रग रिलेटेड है, उसे नहीं पता कि उसके ऊपर ट्रायल किया जा रहा है. उसको वो गवर्नमेंट हॉस्पिटल आता था इलाज के लिए, आप उसको ट्रायल में रिक्रूट कर देते हो. वहां 81 लोग मरे मध्य प्रदेश के अंदर और पूरे देश में 4000 से ज्यादा लोग मरे. उनके
पर ये ऑफिशियली एक्सेप्टेड फिगर नहीं है. मैं
मैं
बार बार इसी बात पे आ रही हूँ कि मुझे तो सबसे ज्यादा तकलीफ इस डिबेट में ये लगती है कि कोई ऐसा स्टैटिस्टिक नहीं है जो accepted by all hai.
That figure is accepted.
We have to accept
No. What I'm saying is that this 80 deaths related or 80 plus deaths related to clinical trials between 2005 2012, he's questioning it because he's saying the data is provided by private companies. He's saying it's, you know, इससे ज़्यादा भी होगा.
RTI है.
Now they are saying नहीं ये सरकारी figure है. My point is therefore you're actually not agreeing on the methodology of coming to this figure.
No, but then let me
देखिए,
clarify
मेरे
one
पास
thing.
तो
I'm so
information
sorry. One second, what I'm saying is the total deaths which have taken place in clinical trial is 3,458.
Over how many years?
From January 2005 to December 2013. This
But
is
that's
the figure.
not what the health secretary said at that time. That's my point.
No, that affidavit is given by Ministry of Health. But what they say is, out of these total deaths, only 89 are attributable to clinical
That's what
trial.
I'm saying.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying. I'm going on
which
saying.
we are questioning.
So related to the trial, they're putting 85?
89.
89, yes.
लेकिन तय कौन कर रहा है?
मैं वही तो पूछ रही हूँ. मैं
तय
भी
तो
वही पूछ
वही
रही
लोग कर रहे हैं जिनको दवा कंपनियां पैसा दे रही हैं. वो लोग तय कर रहे हैं कि ये ड्रग रिलेटेड है या नहीं है. और इवन उसके बावजूद जो लोग मर गए उनकी जिम्मेदारी क्या सरकार की नहीं है, क्या दवा कंपनियों की नहीं? आज वो लोग 7 साल हो गए उस महिला के पति को मरे हुए, आज वो लोग दर दर की ठोकरें खा रहे हैं. क्या ये रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी किसकी है? अब मोदी सरकार बोलती है कि हम मंगल पे जाएंगे, इधर जाएंगे. आपने वैक्सीन मैन्युफैक्चरिंग यूनिट बंद कर दी और इन लोगों की जिम्मेदारी आज सरकारों की नहीं है क्या, कंपनियों की नहीं है क्या? उन लोगों की जिम्मेदारी कौन निभाएगा?
Professor Chauhan and then Dr. Pramesh.
Again, coming to what we are going to, we started debating now, the trials are not done very well.
Yeah.
The figures are not very good.
Yes.
So I think we have to just move beyond that. Let's say figure is exactly what everybody else is saying. They should stop. Soumya has just now said there's a registry for every clinical trial now. As we see, you know, we are missing the point. India is one of the few things we can do well. We provide 60% of all vaccine to the world produced in India. So this is a moment. I'm not saying do a bad trial. I'm not saying don't inform correctly exactly what you're going to, don't pick up a poor population, but you can't be so stringent as you are right now. This is what, I don't know what government has said.
Okay, let me just get Dr. Pramesh and I'll come back to you, Rama.
I think there are a couple of inaccuracies which I would like to point out. The first being that the government doesn't have an accurate figure. So as every event, serious adverse event happens, it's not informed only to the ethics committee. immediately a simultaneous copy goes to the Drug Controller General of India, which is a government body. So it's completely inaccurate and bordering on dishonesty to say that the government doesn't have these numbers. They have simultaneous information on the serious adverse events.
But sir, as a doctor, how do you respond to the charge that is often leveled by Anand Rai or Sanjay Parekh in Madhya Pradesh, from where Anand Rai comes? We in fact saw the Economic Offences Wing actually preparing a report suggesting that some doctors at least were in collusion with pharmaceutical companies.
See, I don't think any of us can deny that there is a part of the research fraternity which doesn't do science the way it should be done. I don't think any of us can dispute that.
Okay.
But don't label the 99% of good research that's getting done with the 1% of bad research that's getting done. And if we stop clinical trials in India, it's a disaster.
No, I think nobody's asking to stop. Nobody's asking to stop clinical trials. Rama, you wanted to come in, and then I want to go into the
I
audience.
just wanted to, make the point that when you talk about the constitution of the ethics committee, it's not just about informing patients. It is about talking about the science of it. So when you look at the composition of the ethics committee, you have very senior doctors in a good ethics committee who are debating the science of it. And given the state of knowledge that's available, you're also predicting what could be adverse events, and how do you then communicate that to the patient. You can never have a foolproof informing system, you can only predict the outcome.
Why are we seeing a class dimension in this? Why are we not seeing educated or the more well-off patients in these volunteering in these trials?
It depends on the disease. For cancer, cancer, you do get middle class patients.
I'll take only one minute, because we are talking of stringent norms.
Yes.
That now they become stringent.
Yes.
Not only that, now look at it. What we wanted the government to do and new rules to come in. Number one, there should be proper informed consent.
Yes.
Now they said videography and audiography should be there. Now it is not stringent. At least it's a voluntary consent. It will come out.
Second so you're saying anyone being part of a trial should be recorded on camera saying, I understand the implications and the risks of what I'm doing.
No, it is not stringent.
Yes.
Now second one is, if I am saying that he should be paid compensation if something happens, death compensation should be there, which was not there. Is it stringent? They are not being paid. Those who have suffered from 2013, the government says they have died because there was no rule for compensation. They will not be compensated. So the third thing which we are saying is that if death is taking place because of negligence of the doctor, there should be some criminal liability. Fourth thing we are saying is, new chemical entity, there should be some kind of a guideline whether we really require for our country. This is the only thing.
Soumya, quickly come in on that, and I do need to go to Vivek.
I'll just clarify some of these things.
Yes.
I think what the recent revisions have been basically to see that you can't treat all clinical trials the same way, and that was one of the reasons why everything shut down. You go anywhere in the world today, they say, oh, India, gosh, we don't want to come and collaborate with you guys because nothing ever gets done in India. Just go round and round with regulations. So we've said now that most of the clinical trials that are done at Tata Memorial or any number of hospitals, for example, are with already registered drugs. And they're trying different combinations in different conditions and so on.
And not testing new drugs.
And they're not testing new drugs.
Why is that?
These can be managed by the local ethics committees. Everything doesn't need to come to CDSCO because there's limited capacity for one organization to monitor and supervise everything in the country. However, compensation will apply regardless of what kind of trial you're doing. It should apply. The other point that he brought up was about the compensation being paid and action against the investigators who are doing unethical. I think we should have that. We are trying to bring a law now, the biomedical ethical guidelines for the country, which is so far only guidelines and recommendations made by the ICMR. It doesn't have any legal teeth.
Okay,
we're trying to bring that in as a law.
So now I want to bring to you the stories of Vivek and Kamla, and we'll talk to both of them, and they really bring together the two aspects of this debate. Vivek's wife Kusum is actually suffering from lung cancer. That's Kusum there. And is that your child?
Yeah.
How old is your child now?
He is now 7 years, and when she was diagnosed, he was 3 years old.
Okay, so that's Kusum. Kusum was diagnosed with lung cancer when she was 29 years old, and she's in the 4th stage of cancer now. She took part in a clinical trial in 2015, was among the first patients to do that. Vivek, tell us a little bit about why you decided at that time that I do want to try this. I want to try it. I want to try it for my wife.
If you ask me what is clinical trial, for me it is life-saving. My wife or I would not be sitting here talking with you. My wife would not be sitting right now at home if clinical trial would not be there. She was the first patient. At the time when we decided to go in the clinical trial, because there was no drug in India, everything was tried and everything was failed. And she, doctor told weeks or 2 weeks for them. And then we
आपको बोला गया कि 1 या 2 हफ्ते में
yeah,
is
so
all
the-
she has to live.
Yeah, all she has to live. And then we came to know that this is a clinical trial going to come, and this drug is already being reviewed or going clinical trial in US and other countries, and we decided to go for it. And now after 2 years, she lived an amazing life. She saw our son to grow. And unfortunately, sorry to comment few of the things, when they say every data they are saying is from there is about 2005 to 2013. My wife cancer type is only 5% of lung cancer, and in 2012 up to 2012 there was no drug. This is 2016. Now there are 17 drugs available, 321 trials going on, and in India we do have only 3 trials. My wife got severe paralytic attack yesterday because our current drug it has stopped to work. It is normal in stage 4 cancer. There are 17 drugs available from Singapore, Thailand, Korea to US. In India we don't have, sir, any drug. And I'm asking to everyone, what is fault of mine? What is fault of my wife and my small son? There is same disease patient died in Chennai because next drug is available in US as approved. I'm not talking only about clinical trials, sir. That drug is approved, and if I want to purchase it, and I'm a middle class person, 9 lakh per month, and this trial would be there like previous drug, that would be free of cost. And the trial for which my wife, she got enrolled as first patient, because of her and 17 further patients, the drug is now approved, and near about 120 patients are taking that drug. Everybody is talking, stringent or stringent, but we are not getting medicine, and my wife can't wait more than 3 months.
So
if we
you're
are not
saying the
getting
drug
medicine.
that helped her live a little longer is now not working?
Yeah, so it happens in cancer that after 2 years or 3 years at stage 4, they start to get resistance. That's why in other countries they have 17 next generation drug, but I don't have any.
So can I ask you something, that when you of course signed up for this trial and she was the first patient, a little bit of it was also because you felt she was going to die otherwise and you had nothing to lose, right? But did you understand, were you told that this could be the risk? Was anything?
Honestly, we believed it was better than the normal. In 5 years journey in cancer, we went to hundreds of hospitals, privately or government, but within clinical trial. We have everyone 21 days appointment where we meet at least 3 doctors, from junior doctor, senior doctor. We have an assigned person, we have informed consent, video consent, we have done free of cost medical tests that were discussed, shared, everything documented, and every change they provide us the copy. And I'm not talking, I'm living in Gurgaon, okay, trial is in Delhi, and there is nothing about English. Okay, we talk in Hindi and English, every other language. We believe that we much more happy in trial. We don't want to go back to the normal sector.
And you're actually saying that there are drugs available outside that are not available in India, and what fault is that of mine and Kusum? So thank you. We're at least glad, and we do hope that there are more opportunities for her to get better. Poonam, how does a skeptic like you then respond to this story?
No, I'm not skeptical about trials. I am very glad to know that you benefited from these trials, and they should be congratulated for doing it well, and we should learn from what works well, and we should, but when people are not following the guidelines, when ethics are being violated, when rights are being violated, take action, but do everything to ensure that trials are actually...
But you use the word violations. What did you said death is not the only...
Yeah, so I was talking to... Okay, so I'm referring, for example, to a study in the 80s that ICMR did. I'm just taking that as an example, and there are many other such studies in India and globally where the trials, where ethical guidelines were not followed, whereupon the women, when it was found that the lesions had become cancerous, they were not treated in the interest of research to see how long they live or don't live and so on. So I'm talking about issues like this, where there are trials when you don't treat the person.
So
in his case, it is an ideal. And let's make also rules, regulations, laws that instead of delaying the process, hasten the process.
So let's identify where the gaps are, because we won't get anywhere with this conversation if we don't identify where the gaps are. Let's hear a different perspective now. Kamla ji जो हैं, ये मध्य प्रदेश से आई हैं. कमला बाई का जो हस्बैंड थे मन्ना लाल, वो एक कार्डियक अरेस्ट से उनकी डेथ हुई 2009 में. He had enrolled himself for a clinical trial, or he was enrolled for a clinical trial, and this was at the MGM Medical College, Indore. The drug tried was prasugrel, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, prasugrel, which is a drug for cardiovascular disorders. The drug has since been approved. लेकिन कमला जी का कहना है कि भाई उनको समझ नहीं आई कि वो किस चीज़ के लिए एनरोल हो रहे थे और किस तरह से उनके साथ जो बर्ताव हुआ उसके बारे में आप बताइए, क्या हुआ मनाली जी के साथ? उनको किसने कहा कि इस हॉस्पिटल में जाएं और इस ट्रायल का हिस्सा बने?
नहीं सर, हम तो वहीं जाते थे, उनकी तबीयत खराब हो जाती थी, उनको उसकी शिकायत थी, तो अब हमको नहीं मालूम कि वो कौन सी दवा देते कौन सी नहीं देते। हमको देते थे, हम ले आते थे, वो खा लेते थे। वो भी अनपढ़ थे और हम भी अनपढ़ थे।
तो डॉक्टर लोग वहाँ क्या बोले आपको?
कुछ भी नहीं बोले, बस यही वो दवा दे देते थे और हम ले आते। फिर उनकी तबीयत बिगड़ती गई, उनकी तबीयत तो जल्दी दमा उनको भी भराने लग गई, जल्दी जल्दी मतलब उनकी तबीयत खराब होने लगी।
क्या आपको किसी स्टेज पर ये जानकारी थी कि एक जो दवाई है उसका ट्रायल हो रहा है, उसकी एक्सपेरिमेंट हो रही है?
कोई जानकारी नहीं थी इसकी। हमको जैसे वो देते थे वैसे हम ले आते थे, हमको कोई जानकारी इसकी नहीं थी।
आपको कभी डॉक्टर ने नहीं बोला कि देखिए आपके ऊपर, हॉस्पिटल ने नहीं बोला कि एक हम नई जो दवाई है उसको हम टेस्ट करने जा रहे हैं, क्या आप ये टेस्ट करना चाहेंगे?
कुछ भी नहीं बताया, हमको देते थे, हम ले आते थे, हम कुछ जानते नहीं, हम जान पड़ते थे सर हम।
अच्छा, हॉस्पिटल का कहना है, यहाँ पे मेरे पास हॉस्पिटल का रिस्पॉन्स भी है। हॉस्पिटल का कहना है कि वो जो एक कंसेंट फॉर्म होती है जिसमें कहा जाता है कि हम राजी हैं, वो आपने साइन किया?
नहीं, हमने करी नहीं, हमको साइन नहीं आता।
या हो सकता है कि आपने साइन किया बिना समझे कि आप क्या साइन करें?
नहीं, हम साइन मेरे को आती नहीं है तो मैं क्या करूँगी सर। अभी हम वहाँ से आए, रुके।
हस्बैंड का साइन, मन्नालाल जी का?
नहीं, उन्होंने भी कोई नहीं करी साइन, कोई साइन नहीं। वो भी साइन क्या, वो करते ही नहीं थे कुछ।
आनंद राय जी, आपसे पूछूंगी because you're familiar with this case. Professor Anil Bharani, responding to the fact, says that the allegations of death of Mr. Mannalal due to clinical trial participation is totally wrong. The participant suffered from coronary artery disease, and while the medicine may cause bleeding, it cannot cause sudden cardiac death. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I'm just simply saying this is the response in interest of balance from the hospital. आप क्या बोलेंगे?
देखिए, डॉक्टर अनिल भरानी जो है, जो इतना मैंने डिबेट सुना, इसका मैं आपको जीव बताऊं, सबसे ज्यादा जो रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी वो एथिक्स कमेटी पे है। और ये जो डॉक्टर अनिल भरानी, ये खुद उस एथिक्स कमेटी के सेक्रेटरी थे। आप सोचिए कि जब एक सेक्रेटरी इस तरीके से ट्रायल कर रहा है कि एक इलिटरेट आदमी को चूज कर रहा है, वो दलित कम्युनिटी से है, आप ट्राइबल्स को चूज करते हो, आप माइनॉरिटीज को चूज करते हो, कोई भी मिडिल क्लास को आप वहां रिक्रूट नहीं करते हो। यदि ऐसे लोगों पर आप ट्रायल करोगे और ट्रायल करने के बाद उनको आप दूर दूर तक ये नहीं बताओगे कि आपको ट्रायल में रिक्रूट किया जा रहा है। मैं खुद उस हॉस्पिटल में पीजी रेजिडेंट था जब मैंने इस मामले को उजागर किया, तो मैं कोई आउटर आदमी नहीं।
पर जब आप कहते हैं कि दलित्स और आदिवासीज और माइनॉरिटीज और मार्जिनल पीपल को चूज किया जाता है, मुझे इसके बारे में जरा समझाइए, बिकॉज़ आपने विवेक की कहानी भी सुनी।
आप यहाँ डिफरेंशिएट करिए, उनका ट्रायल एक प्राइवेट इंस्टीट्यूट में हुआ, मैं यहाँ गवर्नमेंट सेक्टर की बात कर रहा हूँ, है ना? दोनों में बहुत अंतर है। गवर्नमेंट हॉस्पिटल्स में गवर्नमेंट हॉस्पिटल्स में लोग जाते हैं इलाज के लिए, उनको दूर दूर तक ये नहीं पता होता है, इवन वहां की सरकार को नहीं पता था मैम कि इस हॉस्पिटल में ट्रायल हो रहा है। उनकी सरकार को हमने, मध्य प्रदेश सरकार को हमने बताया कि आपके इंस्टीट्यूट में ट्रायल हो रहे हैं। तब 25 अक्टूबर 2010 को मध्य प्रदेश सरकार ने ट्रायल पर बैन लगाया। उसके बाद जब हमने इन लोगों की लड़ाई शुरू की, तो इनको कोई भी इन्फॉर्म कंसेंट फॉर्म की लीगली कॉपी मिलनी चाहिए, इनके पास कोई कॉपी नहीं थी, कंपेंसेशन नहीं दिया गया, 81 से ज्यादा लोगों की डेथ हुई वहां पर
वो तो मानते ही नहीं ना, वो तो मानते ही नहीं कि ट्रायल
की रिपोर्ट, इट इज इन द स्टेट
नहीं मानेंगे। कभी वो उनके परिवार को करते तो वो समझते कि क्या होता है। मेरा एक ही लड़का और वो कमाने वाले एक ही थे, उनके ऊपर उन्होंने ऐसा करा, उनके खुद के परिवार पे करना था ना, तो उनको मालूम पड़ता। आज हमारे पे बीती, हम जानते हैं हम कैसे कमाते खाते, ये नहीं हमारे को साथ देते तो हमारे क्या हाल होते। मेरा एक ही लड़का है, ये कंपनी को नहीं समझ पड़ती कि कोई गरीब के ऊपर ऐसा हुआ है तो।
आपको फिर मुआवजा मिला उसके बाद?
कुछ भी नहीं मिला सर, अभी तक भी हमारी सुनवाई नहीं होती।
ओके, प्रोफेसर चौहान,
सवाल ये है कि अगर किसी ने गलत काम किया है, या वो गलत काम हमेशा गलत रहेगा, चाहे आज करे चाहे पहले किया हो। जो हम लोग ये बोल रहे हैं कि डिबेट ये है कि ट्रायल्स की जो कंडीशंस है स्ट्रिंजेंटली फॉलो करना चाहिए कि नहीं करना चाहिए। नोबडी विल से कि नहीं करना चाहिए, सब लोग कहें करना चाहिए। So it's like law breaking.
But
any
this
other law.
doctor who sent us this response, Anand, please tell me if I'm right, कि जब economic offences की report आई थी मध्य प्रदेश में, शायद उनका भी नाम आया था.
हाँ, वो चार्जशीटेड है भाई. मध्य प्रदेश सरकार.
So that's why I'm saying this
खिलाफ
doctor who
चार्जशीट
sent us this rebuttal has actually been implicated in this in the past.
They got actually a lot of money, more than a crore, and also foreign trips. And there is actually, we have asked for the action.
See, he's not here to defend himself, so I'm only quoting from a report.
Exactly, but see, none of us are actually going to condone any irregularities, and we shouldn't have a single case as
so the question is, how do you avoid? Listen, this is what happens. Okay, even educated, well-off middle class or upper middle class Indians, you go into a hospital today. I can tell you from personal experience, it is a maze. You have to know somebody, you have to pull strings to get attention from a doctor for 15 minutes, which is uninterrupted. Then they will tell you, ye aap dawai lijiye. Very few of us would ask questions. So she just thought her husband was being treated. I'm not even sure she understood that her husband was part of a trial, Sunila.
Absolutely, but that's what we are saying. We don't want situation like this, and that's where I think what we have to do is, rather than making these broad brush statements, we have to look at current regulations and see how we improve governance on the ground. So we have to bring awareness. Unless and until we have awareness in patients, where we have to work with media, and I'm glad this program is happening, therefore, where we tell people that this is your right as a clinical research participant.
Soumya, yeah.
So see, I have also worked in clinical trials for more than 20 years, Barkha, and I've worked in diseases like TB and HIV, predominantly poor and illiterate people, So there are ways of doing informed consent with illiterate people. They understand perfectly well. Just because they can't read and write doesn't mean they can't understand what they're supposed to do. And I think civil society is important, because this word guinea pig has been used so many times now in the media that anybody who hears the word clinical trial, the next word you think of is guinea pig.
Guinea pigs, yeah. Parliamentary panel had of course spoken about this in 2012.
And we are working to improve the ethics committee. We should have a system for audit of ethics committee. What kind of processes are they following? And I can tell you from sitting on the ethics committee at AIMS, the kind of deliberation and time that is spent on reading the protocol and also talking about the ethical dimensions, and a lot of emphasis being placed on how you write a PIS and how is it actually being transacted.
So please explain to our viewers who don't understand, who sets up this ethics committee? Does the hospital choose? Are they all doctors?
There are guidelines.
And how are they paid?
There are guidelines for it. It has to be a committee which has a representation of clinicians, and it also has to have an ethicist, a social scientist, and a legal person, and a patient representative. Yes, a lay person, an independent person.
So then where are the gaps?
These are now being set up.
It is now.
Barkha, you started.
Earlier it was not.
Yeah, you started with the PIL question. I think the PILs have actually sort of given shape to what the ethics committee should be and how they should function.
I'm going to take a few comments, then I'm coming to you, Dr.
We are speaking about the money which is involved in these clinical trials, and as India is a developing country, so how much money, how much percentage of budget is allocated for these clinical trials?
And who is spending on it? I'm imagining the pharmaceutical companies themselves.
Yes. Because most of the people, they are not getting compensation for this. So I think that money is...
And Sunila, when it's done in government institutions in particular, who's actually... who pays the compensation? Is it the government?
Whoever is the sponsor of the trial has to pay compensation.
Okay.
Just for participation in clinical trials, if that was your question, we cannot make any payment, because that would make that, that would actually mean that we are actually enticing people to be part of clinical trials.
But I thought, like when, for example, the HIV research was being done, there were many more educated people than we see in trials in India. And I'm just trying to understand this difference. Professor Chauhan, if you can help me with this, why is there this difference in class?
I'm going through a clinical trial right now.
Okay.
Going through right now, and we doing this in Bangalore. It took us 15 years to get to where we are. Every person is video recorded. Every person has to be compensated. We had to raise money from all sources. So a good trial is a good trial. A bad trial will always, there will be always black sheep, no matter how stringent conditions you put.
Yeah.
So what we are discussing, what we should stop is just bad behavior of whether it's a drug company, whether it's a PI. So I think central issue is this, how to stop this bad behavior.
And that's why we should talk of regulatory inspections, and again this is law. we have a
Do we
provision
think
in the law.
volunteers should be
The
paid?
10
1 minute. I'm
guidelines-
just throwing out a point here. Should
The
volunteers be paid?
guidelines that ICMR has, vulnerability, there's a huge paragraph and there are guidelines for vulnerability, and it says that only if people who are deemed to be vulnerable are needed for a trial should they be included.
Absolutely.
Isn't that
Yeah,
right?
but I just
Okay,
want
okay, Dr. Pravesh, yeah.
So I think I'll just very briefly address the issue of the difference in quality between government centers and private
Yes.
centers. I think that's so unfortunate to come out with a conclusion with that, like
Yeah,
that, with absolutely no proof.
No, who's come out
The
with that
ta-
conclusion?
No, there was
He,
some.
Anand Rai is
Yes.
making the point
Correct.
that in government, yes.
So the Tata Memorial Center where I work is a government institute. We do about 100 trials annually. And the quality of the data documentation that we documented, we actually published this paper, that the quality of data documentation as well as the conduct of the trial was identical to that with any of the other
But
centers.
none
in the
of
West.
you have answered
So-
my question about the volunteers. Is there or is there not a class dimension to the volunteers? I mean,
So-
if
so
anyone
there
would
is-
take this question.
There is not, and
There is not.
I'll give you data.
That's what I want to
I'll
know.
give you data to support that. We are currently running a trial, and we did. It's so fortunate that this meeting is happening today because just 2 weeks back we did exactly the same analysis of our data. The Tata Hospital has 40% of patients who pay for their treatment, that is
Yes.
private patients, and 60% of patients who are completely free.
Okay.
So there is a 60-40 ratio.
Okay.
And when we looked at the accrual onto our trial, which is over 550 patients in Tata Memorial Center alone,
Yeah.
the ratio was exactly 55-45. You can't get any closer than that.
Okay.
You actually had more private patients accruing as part of the. This is solid data.
Very quickly, depends what trials you're doing.
exactly.
If it
That
is a
is the
TB
point.
trial, or
Yes.
if it is an HIV trial, or a malaria trial, I mean, you can't be doing malaria trial here. There's very little transmission. You won't get any results out of
But
it.
you know, for example, talking about malaria, sir, we had this dengue vaccine that there was talk that it should be brought in with all the dengue cases that were happening. Then it wasn't because I think it hadn't gone through its phase
No,
3
so
trial in India.
There are two issues very quickly about the dengue vaccine. Its efficacy, although it's already working in Mexico, Philippines, and so on. Its efficacy is about 60%. So the debate is, should we immunize people when efficacy only 60%? But a lot of people, but there is HPV vaccine which is 100% efficacious. We
But
still
it has
debate-
been
we
opposed
still
by
de-
many groups.
we
I
still-
mean, people
we're
like
still
Poonam and
debating
others
this.
have opposed
but-
the
but
HPV
let me
There's
just-
a
vaccine
cost
trials.
issue. Ethical trial also looks at cost issues. Is there a cheaper vaccine? I'm not against the efficacy of this vaccine is not in question.
Okay.
But there are cheaper vaccines. For instance, NICE, the standard setting agency in England, did not accept this vaccine because they said with the same efficacy, you can get a vaccine at half the price. So you have to look at cost
No, if
too.
you get cheaper
That's a different
vaccine,
issue.
you get a
That's a
cheaper
different issue.
efficacious
That's
vaccine.
a-
Nobody
the
asks.
public
No, but
health
since she
manual-
said that
No, I'm just saying that at the
nobody's
time the
against-
vaccine was being tested, it was opposed.
It was,
Again, now I just want to get a comment and then Soumya and
I'm Dr. Sumit Dhawan, and I myself have gone under the clinical trials. So
As in you've been part of it or you've conducted it?
I have been a part of it.
What was the trial?
The trial was a homeopathic pathogenetic trial. It was conducted in Central Research Institute of Homeopathy in Noida. And
Why did you become part of it?
because I wanted to contribute to it, not because of any appreciation of money or anything.
Were you paid?
Yeah, I was paid for it, and everyone who was there apart for it and who had actually contributed to the trial, who had told the symptoms and everything, they were paid for it. And everyone.
And just to ask, how much is somebody paid to take part in a clinical?
See, it depends on how closely you are able to tell the symptoms and everything. I got paid 8,000 and someone got 12,000 also within a span of 3 hours.
But this is what I want to come back to. Should you be paid or should you not be paid? If we pay, will it encourage poorer people to sign up and then become part of the trial? So I'm not sure where I come in on this. I mean, I'm a little uncomfortable in fact with people.
Everyone should be.
There is a thin line between incentives and compensation.
I wanted to tell you
Okay, Sanjay and then Soumya. Yeah.
Now, see, when
I'll come back
what
to
we projected before the court
Yes.
was the thing that there were certain intermediaries
Yeah.
between the drug company and where the trial was taking place.
Yeah.
And they said, we'll get the entire clinical trial done, say within a period of week, within a period of 2 weeks, etc. So these intermediaries will ultimately go, talk to these people, tribals and poor people, illiterate people, collect them for the purpose of
So
clinical
do we
trial.
think people should
This
be
is-
paid for trials or not?
They-
I mean, if nobody's saying a clear
the
thing.
question is whether they were paid 2,000 rupees, 1,000 rupees, they were
Yes,
brought
but
in.
for a poor
Now-
person, 2,000 rupees is a lot of money.
That's what I'm saying.
And
Now-
like even in
now
the
you have put a
United
question.
States, you
now
have
you have put a question. I'll answer that.
Yes.
The good trial is when you take informed consent voluntarily, like the gentleman just now
Vivek,
said.
yes.
Yeah, agreed. There is no difficulty about good trials, clinical trials, there is no problem.
But should
today
we be paying
talking,
volunteers
today
or
we are
not?
talking
No, we
of
should not be
Should we
paying.
be
No,
paying
we should
volunteers?
not be
We should
paying.
not.
There
We
should
should
be
not.
no payment for
It should not be
participation.
an inducement,
yeah.
but ethics committee.
I just want to ask then, how was he
should be
paid?
treatment.
Is there a law against paying?
No,
No,
you
there
can be
is no law.
compensated
So
for
these
your
are,
time.
these are the gaps,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
We don't even know right now whether we should be paying volunteers or not. These are gaps that
You're
can be
allowed to
addressed.
compensate them for their time. but it's-
Compensation.
Yeah, not-
One minute.
that shouldn't be an
Compensation if
inducement.
something goes wrong.
No, no, compensate for their time. After all, they're going to lose.
Isn't that
It's like
payment?
an inducement.
Yeah, but you're losing
Isn't
wages
that
that
payment?
day.
No, no, no. Again, you know, again,
No,
I
no,
think
the
this needs to be
compensation for
clarified.
time.
One minute. Soumya,
Spent.
I need
Yeah.
clarity from you on
Yeah.
this. Should volunteers be paid or not?
If you're going to tell people to stay away from their daily work and they're going to lose wages, you're allowed to give them those wages. It should not be like 5 times more as an inducement.
But
And you said they should not be paid, Dr. Pamesh.
I'll qualify that statement. There are two kinds of trials which are done. One on healthy volunteers,
Yes.
which is
Yeah.
a different
Yes.
issue altogether.
Yes.
The second on patients.
Yes.
So when healthy volunteers get onto a trial, you are compensating them for the time that they have lost off work.
Were you
the time they
compensated
spent.
for that?
Yes, I
Would you have taken part if you were not being paid?
Yes, I would have been a part because I wanted to contribute. But my point is that the interest of the private pharmaceutical companies, that is the main issue which is giving rise to unnecessarily needed drugs. For example, there are so many vaccines which are there which are not even necessary, but they are being, proved on. And there are
Give me an example, because
chickenpox vaccine. You suffer from a chickenpox vaccine once in a lifetime, and then you are free from it.
I was inoculated as a child. I think all of us were. Professor John, let me get you in on that, because this vaccines debate has somehow returned to our lives. Okay, let him speak now. He's saying that actually vaccines that are not needed are being pushed into the market. Okay, now sir, let him speak.
That's actually not true.
Yeah, let him speak. Anand ji, I asked him the
That's
question.
not, there was such, वो ठीक नहीं है कि आपको नहीं वैक्सीन लेना तो मत लीजिए as a
Choice
child.
is
As a-
good.
Yeah,
yes,
let's
sir.
have choice.
So
Yeah.
choice is there.
Sir, please,
So
now enough.
there are 7 or 8 vaccines. If your child is born in a hospital, you get them. If you don't get them, what will happen? What happened in America recently? So they got rid of measles. They thought
Yeah.
measles is, we don't know what measles is.
Yeah.
When the outbreak happened, they didn't even have the vaccine. So that society actually has benefited. I'm not even debating this. We have benefited enormously by these 7 or 8 vaccines. which
Okay,
are-
I do have to take last comments from all of you. Sir, I'm out of time now. I'm moving on here, ma'am.
I'm also a life scientist, and I had also once volunteered to be in a trial, and this was for statin drugs, and I was supposed to be a healthy volunteer. So what I wanted to find out was, is our ethical committees or our protocols, do they do the same thing? Well, this was done in Canada, so this was not in India. Like, I was taken up and I was tested for each and every disease, and my entire medical history was taken. And I had cleared various steps, and finally they did say, okay, we'll take you in. But then the last blood test that they did, they found that I was a pre-diabetic, and I was rejected for it. So is that kind of a protocol followed in India too?
Yes.
If that is done and followed properly,
A short
then I
answer
think
is yes.
yes.
Absolutely, yes.
Rama, you wanted to come in, and I don't know if you agree with Professor Chauhan.
I'm very glad she raised this point, because I think some of the objections that were raised in the PIL was also precisely this. Have you screened clinically the population that you're going to intervene?
Yeah.
And then what happens post the trial?
Yeah.
Do you track? And I think there is a weak link there. That is my view.
Okay, I have to take last comments. We'll take one more question here, and Vivek, I'll get you.
A simple question. There are vaccinations which are being developed in the US and required in the European markets. However, the tests are being conducted in India. Just because India has there's a population which is illiterate and is not able to afford, why are those trials being conducted here only?
Okay, one figure says, Sunila, why don't you take this, that it's 60% cheaper to conduct a trial in India.
Yes,
So,
That's
okay, that's a planning commission
The law
figure.
requires that you have
Okay, Sunila now.
So everybody knows that we are 16% of global population, and we have 20% of global disease burden. The global clinical trials that happen in India are less than 1.4% as of 2012 data, and today that has even gone down. So it is absolutely incorrect to say that people are coming to India because India the trials are cheaper. People are not coming to India for trials today. That's the problem, and that's why we have patients like Kusum waiting for drugs. Because
Vivek,
had
you
those
wanted to
drugs
say something? Yeah.
So I have a couple of comments. So first to you that In US for this disease, 67 trials going on. In Europe, 42 trials going on. In Korea, 17 trials going on. In Singapore, 12. Here, only 2 trials going on. So we are nowhere.
Okay, Anandji. I'll start with last comments. 30 seconds, everybody.
Anandji. कि आप जैसे एजुकेटेड लोग आगे आए और ट्रायल में पार्टिसिपेट करें. 90% लोग आप मार्जिनल कम्युनिटी से यदि लेंगे तो हम तो यही समझेंगे ना कि आप जानबूझकर उनको रिक्रूट कर रहे हैं. 3 गवर्नमेंट की मैन्युफैक्चरिंग यूनिट थी, तीनों को बंद कर दी गई. प्राइवेट सेक्टर अभी वैक्सीन मैन्युफैक्चरिंग कर रहा है जो 20 गुना ज्यादा कीमत पर वैक्सीन को डंप किया जा रहा है. जब यहाँ आपके इम्यूनाइजेशन प्रोग्राम में वैक्सीन कंपल्सरी
बंद की गई जो सरकारी थी.
ये तो मोदी जी से पूछिए और यूपीए सरकार से पूछिए कि क्यों बंद कर दी गई. आप मंगल पे यान भेज रहे हैं, वो ज्यादा जरूरी है कि वैक्सीन ज्यादा जरूरी है इस देश के लिए.
Okay, let's start with concluding comments. We'll start with you, Sanjay.
I feel that the new norms which have been brought in have made actually clinical trial little costlier, and they think that is the stringency. Otherwise, earlier it was cheaper, and that's the reason. Otherwise, nobody is coming in the way of conducting proper trials in the country. If you want to have ethical, good trials, it is welcome. Nobody is coming in the way. It is because of the cost. Now they are saying that there is a problem.
I'm a medical student, and I have this question that whenever somebody takes part in a clinical trial, they're given utmost care, very attentive care. They're almost given VIP treatment. Each and every change in
which is what Vivek said, that it was easier than to go to a doctor in the normal course.
So each and every change in their health is monitored, even if they are given a placebo of the drug itself. So if this kind of drug is given to people who can't afford proper healthcare, how is that exploitation? These vulnerable people can't afford this kind of healthcare anyway.
You're questioning the class dimension to the volunteers debate. RNG, do you want to answer that?
अभी आप बताइए प्लेसिबो ट्रायल के बारे में किसी को जानकारी होती है कि आप एक डमी ड्रग दे रहे हो जिसका कुछ भी नहीं होगा. आप प्लेसिबो ट्रायल दे रहे हो, प्लेसिबो दवा दे रहे हो, लोगों को वो उसको ये लग रहा है कि मेरा ट्रीटमेंट चल रहा है, लेकिन आप तो उसको शक्कर की गोली दे रहे हो.
Okay, Sunila, last comment.
So the current regulations are appropriately balanced in favor of all stakeholders. I think we have to give a system a chance and move forward and see how we can really leverage what we have in the country in terms of medical expertise, because if we have to treat our mammoth disease burden, we need a clinical research agenda of our own as a country, and unless we do that, we are not going to find answers to our unmet medical need.
Rama, one thing you'd like to see change?
I really think that we need to have a system of audit. We need to strengthen the ethics committee irrespective of whether it's the public or the private sector. I think we have good ethics committees. Let that be gold standard. Let's talk about like Tata Memorial. Let's create gold standards. What do we expect from ethics committees? How do we expect clinicians to behave? How do we treat patients who come for clinical trials? I think that would be a way forward.
I think I'd second that, and I'd just conclude by saying that good clinical research is imperative. It needs to continue, and what we all need as the entire stakeholders of this very important enterprise is to make sure that that end is achieved, and in very short time.
There can be no compromise with good, and we need good ethical research, and where there are gaps, let's fill them, and where there are people not following the guidelines, let's regulate them better and ensure that we do not ever use the word guinea pigs by making people guinea pigs.
Professor Chauhan.
I think we should do more programs like this, because this misconception that anything that is not tested in US or Holland has come to India for testing, this is absolutely not true. It simply cannot happen. India is the most economic place to make vaccines. That's where only one area we are ahead of China, if you ask me, if you compare, is India better than China when it comes to injectables.
All right, Soumya, last word.
I think, we have to remember, we not get bogged down in history. We have to learn from the mistakes made in the past, but not keep going back and saying that's the reason why we shouldn't be moving ahead. I totally agree that people who participate in clinical trials often get access to standards of treatment far, far better than what they would have got otherwise. But I totally agree, we have to work together to really improve the quality of the sites where the trials are done, the investigators, the institutions and the ethics committees.
Right.
And I think also tell people they should ask questions. Any participant, illiterate or not, has a right to know what's going on and
I think it would be fair to conclude to say that while of course there should be no restriction on research and science and clinical trials per se, we do need more attention on issues of consent and on any class dimensions that do make those volunteers, some volunteers more vulnerable than others. I think that's the only thing to underline. Thanking our panelists and our audience, leaving it there. Thank you very much.